we're going to find out how to test knives and to find out how good their quality is from different features. Hello everyone, I am Jonathan, also known as the PC Genie. Now we're going to have a look at a few different things about knives and basically get an idea, like I said, of how to gauge different features about them and their quality. Okay, so when it comes to checking the quality of a knife, there are a few different things that you can look at. Now the first one that we're going to look at is sharpness. Now of course you can use it to do something like cut up vegetables and whatnot and get a bit of an idea instinctively over time, and testing it on things like test cutting, say against bottles filled with water. But one of the best ways to test is quite simply get a piece of paper and then just try, rather than doing something that involves chopping, in which case a heavier knife that's not necessarily sharper will do the trick okay. In this test, it purely tests the sharpness of the edge. So just take it right from the 40, the bit close to the hilt, and then I try drawing it along like that. And it also is very useful for testing if there are sharper and duller spots, because it won't necessarily, like there, so you see if I try this on this improvised knife I made myself, I tried to cut and I already know from that test that somewhere in this sort of region, that's why I'm rubbing my finger along it without being scared, it's blunt. But when it gets to about here and onwards, I know it is much sharper, because again I'll show you. Put the knife on the paper. Yeah. It isn't overall that sharp, this particular knife, but as it's hopefully shown you, there are areas here which are very blunt, and then from this sort of bit, maybe from about here upwards, it gets much sharper. So that is told by this simple test. I'll show you with another example. This is a knife I found at work by Snap-on. Now this one I've found to be generally quite good. So I'll show you a test of this. It's not got much to cut with, but because it's a short blade, but as you can see, whenever I put it on there, put it there, I just draw along. I don't press. All I'm doing is just pushing down enough that if it does slice, it will go through. But I'm not really trying to force it. Just slice. Oh, it's going to cut into my thumbnail. There it is again. And again. And you'll also see the paper actually tells a story as well. So if we look at this, I'll see if the camera can show you. That actually shows it's very clean in the slicing. Now I look at this one from the earlier blade. Wait for the camera to focus in. I don't know if you can see or not, but on the paper you can actually see fibres, you can see rough edges. That's where you can tell, even if it did actually cut okay, if you see rough edges, it tells you that the actual knife itself has a bit more of a rough and not very smooth cutting edge. Whereas an example like this is from a much better quality knife where it does a much cleaner cut. For one more example, well, in fact I can give a couple more, so we'll go for this one, just quickly. There we are. Obviously it cut deeper. That, in this case, is to do with the fact that there's more blade to play with. But it's actually slightly less sharp than a knife we used before. How can I tell? Because I can see a few more fibres. However, there's not much difference between them. So we take this last example and we go very fibrous, and that tells me this is not holding a very sharp edge. Our next test is the file test. This is to test the hardness. So even if you've got a knife that is sharper or duller for whatever reason, one of the things that can help tell you how long an edge will last on a knife is with the file test. So there is a degree of what's called Rockwell Hardness. Files, of course, are designed to really scrape away at the metal, so they're very hard. And this gives us, especially if you know the hardness, and there's a particular set that I was looking to buy which actually has specific Rockwell hardnesses, so it would be this one of the red colour handle is 60 and then 50 and then 40, sort of yellow, green, whatever. And that means that you can get a sort of a known quantity, a file which is this hard, and then you quite simply scrape it along the edge and you find out how much it either skates across or how much it digs in. So with this particular example, it's a bit of a, obviously as we've seen earlier, it's a bit softer, so you can hear it's digging a bit more. Also, if you don't mind the edge getting a little bit damaged, you can be even more aggressive and use the edge or corner of a file. Yeah, I'll show that to the camera now. There we are. We'll see around here. No, sorry, just there. The file dug in quite a bit. It's because this is very soft. So it means even if, hypothetically, this was a very sharp edge, it won't stay that way for very long. I'll take another example. This is one I figure will be quite soft because I had been testing it, throwing it around earlier, and it did deform a bit, but didn't snap. So I theorise it will be very soft. Yeah, that's digging in. In fact, it might actually be even softer than the one I made myself many years ago. So, I don't know if you'd be able to see it. I'll see if I can get the camera to focus. Yeah. I don't know if it's easy enough for you to tell, because I'm using a tiny screen, but those are scratch marks all over it, and that's because the file is biting in. Again, the more aggressive version, so I will pick this spot. Yeah. Right, I'll put my finger just on the bit where it's supposed to be. See if the camera will focus. And you'll see there is a little, almost a valley. And that was made by my file. It's bit in a lot. Now if we look at this example, this I figure will have some softness but not a huge amount. Yeah. So it is scratching it a bit, so this file is harder than this knife. But files are very hard in general. But comparatively, it's not digging in as much. It's skating along and sliding off more easily. Now I'll do the more aggressive version. Yeah, I'm struggling. You'll see I'm moving around on it a lot, which is a good sign. It's not digging in and making notches or grooves, so yeah. I'll show you the spot where I did it. Right. Here we are. So it's around my finger. It didn't really do much. I can feel with my finger it has rolled the edge over slightly on the other side. But this knife is much harder. Now we take this example, which I have found to be quite resilient, and I figure will have the sharpest edge, so let's give it a test. So I go like this. Oh wow. It might have slight scratching, let me check. Alright, now for the aggressive test. Okay. So again, same sort of thing. I'll have to show you close up. But I don't know if you can see what I was able to see with my own naked eye, looking at it closer. But essentially, although it made a tiniest bit of rolling possibly, you know, a little bit of scratching on it, overall this is a very hard edge. And it's certainly going to retain the sharp edge for much longer, unless it hits something like stone or something else hard that will cause it to chip away. So this is an example of a much harder blade, whereas if we take something like this, it's a much softer blade, and we've been able to tell by the fact that this knife has barely scratched at all, and this knife has taken deep canyons of scratching in it. Now there is one other way that you can test. If you don't have a file handy, or you don't know the hardness, if you know the hardness of one knife, and you want to know the hardness of another knife, there is, perhaps not the most recommended, but certainly one way in which you can test the edge retention and the hardness, which is like this. Yeah. So basically you just take the two edges and meet them into each other and see what bits have chipped off or have deformed. In this case, the edge on this knife, my smaller knife by Snap-on, has almost completely remained intact, whereas on this one it's becoming more like a saw blade. I mean, this side obviously is designed to be serrated, but this edge, this one that's supposed to be smooth, will end up pretty much the same way. So that's one more way in which you can test knives. The next way we test the quality of the knife is by the weight distribution. So, take the knife, and of course I do the usual thing, find out its balance point, which is put it on my finger and find out where it balances evenly. So it's somewhere around here. So this knife is a little bit back weighted into the handle. We test the next one, be this one. So, whoop. Yeah, same sort of thing. We test this knife. Balanced about here. And then we test this knife. So, oof. As you can tell, it's very handle heavy. Here we are, almost. Somewhere around there. So one of the things you can find out from the weight distribution is how good it will be at things like chopping actions. I personally recommend having, well, since it's a knife, really further forward is better. Because if you look at something like a sword, that's going to make a much greater difference. Excuse me, and you want the weight much closer to the handle, so that it's going to be not light and nimble. But on something like a knife, unless you've got something obscenely large and heavy and almost reaching sword dimensions, you do want it to be more forward weighted if you want it to be able to do cutting and chopping more. So examples like this knife, I have always found it's very back weighted, and it's the best way to compare how it feels in the hand and how well it cuts is if you take a hammer and hold it upside down so that the actual head part is underneath your hand and the handle is above it, how hard can you strike with that? Not very hard, because the weight is all the way behind you, instead of in front of you, where you can chop better. And that's going to be a bad feature. But potentially it can be more nimble and fast if it's back-weighted. But again, it's not really going to make a significant difference since knives are so lightweight and so nimble anyway. So again, I recommend, personally, that knives be more forward weighted, so then you can have something that acts in the same way as a meat cleaver, but without it necessarily being heavy. And that's the thing, if you have something like this which is actually a heavier knife, but it's more back weighted, it doesn't chop into things like wood or vegetables or other things better. You actually find knives that, well, I don't have any examples personally, but if you have a knife that's more forward weighted, even if it's not necessarily as heavy, it will cut and chop better. So yes, that's the features of the knives, and there will be a few other things to test as well. Ah yes, I nearly forgot. The handle structure. So, take of course the knife, test it like this. So this one, it's a very old knife. Yeah, pommel started coming out. If you can hear. This one's a little bit loose, but that's because it's a very old knife. In fact, it's basically 10 years old already, so hence why it is starting to come apart. Then you look at other knives. This one, It has had some wear and tear before I obtained it. You can hear just by wobbling it side to side, back and front. But this is a lock knife. This is a one that folds in. So hence, it's going to be more likely to come apart and come loose sooner. But overall, the construction's sturdy enough. And this one, although it's very crap in terms of its blade, as we found out from the rest of the testing, the cast sort of plastic, sort of hard plastic handle is actually very sturdy. So you'll notice there are varying degrees of quality in the blades. Some of them are better in some areas, some are better in other areas. It's like I would guess that this is almost certainly never going to come apart, despite the fact that it is just cast plastic, and you can find examples of knives that would end up coming loose with the different pieces just falling to bits. It's just that in this case, rather than it being a poor construction, it's a poor quality and tempering of blade. So again, you won't necessarily find blades that are entirely superior in every facet, and blades that are entirely inferior in every facet. It's going to be a trade-off, and a look at what sorts of features you want the most in a knife. But again, overall, you should find that across those different factors, you will find some knives come out better for what you want, and others come off much worse. So I hope that was informative, and I shall see you in the next video. Ta-ra for now.